right, now I'd like to welcome member Jill Ryan, who will introduce our main speaker today. Jill.
Hanson has titled his presentation, Tried and True, Storytelling as an Antidote to the Information Glut. Hanson Hosein.
Thanks. Full disclosure, I wrote that bio and that introduction. And just to add to it a little bit more, I was born in England to parents from Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean with ancestry from Iran, Afghanistan, India, Venezuela. I grew up in London, Connecticut, Edmonton, Alberta, Toronto, and that sounds like that's the worst thing in journalism. The worst thing you could be accused of is parachuting into a story. So the first thing you're going to think, well, what does this guy have to do with Seattle? Well, I have two great attributes to my street cred here. First of all, the first time I ever set foot in the city of Seattle was 10 years ago this week. I was taking a break from covering the wars in the Middle East and thought I would chase this girl who was living in Seattle. And I thought, what a great way to spend a break out in Seattle, far away from tear gas and mayhem. So you can imagine what happened 10 years ago this week in Seattle. I got caught right in the middle of it, even in the curfew and everything else. So it was a familiar feeling. And secondly, my wife was born in Renton and was Miss Maple Valley in 1988. So I think I have full rights to be here before you today. So I apologize, the acoustics in here are really boomy, so I hope you can hear me okay. First of all, this caught me at a disadvantage because I'm a digital media guy, I'm a professor, and I usually have all the tools of technology at my disposal when I'm talking to my classes. I got Twitter going, I'm streaming our classes live to the world, we have online platforms, and I've got PowerPoint. And all I've got now is just pen and paper. And so what do I say now to this very important audience that's going to keep you interested without all these accoutrements that normally keep people engaged? So because of these concerns, I actually broadcast them to the world through my Twitter and Facebook account. And this is what I said. Prepping for tomorrow's Seattle Rotary Club talk, possibly 300 attendees and no PowerPoint. Might relive live TV days, do a 45-minute tirade. Now, within 2 minutes, I received this response from one of my followers. Talk about Tiger, Afghanistan, Glenn Beck, healthcare, gay marriage, and tween vampire movies, football, and the recession, and you'll be set. Oh, and service above self. I made sure that I just wanted to confirm that is the slogan for the Rotary Club, right? Okay, all right. But obviously I'm not going to have anything to help me do this, so what I'm going to do is return to my old roots as a television news reporter, and I sort of wrote out 3 lines, and I'm going to build my talk upon that. And I'm going to do it by telling you a story, but before I do that, as Jill mentioned, I am writing a book about storytelling, and in fact, in the last few weeks since I gave her that information, things have changed. So first I want to try out the working title on you, maybe we can talk about it during the Q&A. So here's the working title. The paradigm of narrative as it relates to social trust and the conveyance of knowledge in network systems and society. Okay, I'm just joking. I left my shoulder patches and pipe at home today. I'm still new to academia. So here's the real working title. Trust me, how to tell stories in a credibility-starved world. So this lies at the heart of what I'm doing at the University of Washington and my work generally. And I'll give you the 3 bases to this premise and to this title. First of all, thanks to digital media technology, both in content creation and distribution, everybody in the world now, if they have access to some of these democratized tools, can be a media company. Even just today, I was listening to NPR, and I heard that after President Obama's speech on Afghanistan last night, the Taliban had issued their rebuttal, and they had posted it to their website. And it's very odd to think about this is how we communicate in the 21st century, that even extremist groups or militant groups are using the same tools that we normally associate with large, credible organizations. But that's indeed what's happening. We all have access to these tools. So if that's the case, it's both a wonderful opportunity to hear more voices, and sometimes you don't want to hear those voices, if they're especially from these extremist groups, but it also creates much more noise in the communication environment, and we don't know who to listen to and who to trust. We traditionally had the brand name of journalism and large organizations that tell us this is what we should listen to and this is what we should believe. That is disappearing very quickly. So I believe that storytelling, that old thing that is as old as our species, is a really compelling way to overcome this disadvantage and this challenge of communication in the 21st century. And it's by actually telling a story to a community of participants through authentic conversation, and by doing that, you build a relationship. And I'll explain to you a little bit more about that in a second. Lastly, my third premise to this idea is that I started my career in New York at NBC, which is touted as the media capital of the world. And I'm sometimes very frustrated here in Seattle that I can't get the same attention that I would get in New York if I was having lunch on a weekly basis with folks from the New York Times, like my colleagues at Columbia University are. And so what I'd like to think is that with Seattle, with its really engaged citizenry, with an amazing public media community, with the largest Rotary club in the world, which totally daunts me, this is the place where we don't have to compete with the media capital of the world, because we can be the storytelling capital of the world with all of these wonderful attributes. And that's something that I'm trying to build through our program at the University of Washington. So let me begin with my story. You heard a little bit of my bio. Let me fill in some of the blanks to explain to you why it's so relevant to what I'm talking about today. First of all, I started out as a lawyer, but I decided I was going to get one more degree and go to Columbia University and try out journalism. And I received these two messages. First of all, in 1994 from my journalism professor that I was about to join the first downwardly mobile profession. So that was, leaving law for something that wasn't going to pay was kind of scary. And then I got the job at NBC. They hired me before I graduated, and they said, the vice president of NBC News told me, more and more people will be joining this craft of journalism, which also means there'll be less money to pay them. So be aware of what you're getting yourself into. And this was in 1995, before the internet really started, taking jobs and money away from journalism, as some people say. I don't believe that's true. I think journalism was already on its way down in terms of its economic model well before that. So I still signed on. I got that job at Tom Brokaw. I went to Tel Aviv. And I was really great for a guy in his 20s to start playing, at this level, to travel the world, to pay relatively well, to meet girls, and to report on really important stories. I wanted to be James Bond, and that's what was happening. But the first couple of years were pretty interesting in Israel, but what I noticed as I was traveling around to a lot of these war zones is that for me as an NBC journalist, I usually went with an entourage of a producer, cameraman, correspondent, sound man, sometimes even a satellite technician. 5 people, $25,000 out the door before you could even start reporting on the story. In fact, I missed the heyday of journalism. Back in the 1970s, cameramen would tell me that when they flew to cover a story, they would fly first class, and then because their camera was so expensive, the camera would get a first-class seat as well. So that was beginning to go away even when I was in journalism. But that's the way big news journalism was operating overseas. But when I'd go to these war zones, I started seeing people my age or younger showing up with smaller cameras, telling really interesting, different stories from the ones that I was compelled to tell because of the big infrastructure and template and model of news that NBC did. And that was highly attractive to me. And so even though I was doing really well in my career, I decided to pull out. I wanted to learn how to use these new technologies, so at the height in 2001, I gave up my stock options, took my couple of awards, and I quit. And I decided that I was going to learn how to use these new technologies because I thought it was really important. I'd already gotten the foreshadowing warning signs from my professor and from that NBC News executive, and I didn't want to get caught in the trample that is now happening of people trying to figure out what the future of journalism is. And so I started to become what I call a backpack journalist, which means, in my backpack down there, in one small bag that I could carry on a plane, I'd have a camera, a laptop, and some kind of internet connection through my cell phone that essentially allows me to carry a professional broadcast studio with me. And that was fairly revolutionary because that actually attacks the economic model that television news and journalism generally is based upon. And so I started doing that. And then I got a call from NBC in 2003 saying, we really like to have you back in an independent way because the Pentagon is starting this new system of embedding journalists for the war. But all of our journalists, none of them know how to do everything, and they're only allowing 1 or 2 people in each military unit. So since you can do everything, maybe you can join us for this grand adventure. And so I did. And so I was embedded with the military. I went live from the USS Abraham Lincoln with my laptop and my little camera, about $10,000 worth of equipment. And it was quite amazing to see this stuff in action. And then I traveled around the Middle East for the next 6 months, covering the aftermath of the war, and going live from places like Damascus and Beirut, using very inconspicuous pieces of technology and not having to be forced to use state-run television and maybe censorship in those countries. So it was really amazing. when I came back from Iraq, I decided that, it was nice to be able to do this stuff within television news, but I had to push it a little further. I like to shoot myself in the foot career-wise, and I've done that several times, and I thought I'll do it one more time. So I decided to give up on television news altogether. I had this idea about how I was seeing a growing resistance to corporate chains in America, Walmart, Starbucks, and the like. And so I proposed that we do this story based on John Steinbeck's Travels with Charlie in the 1960s, which I thought was also a pivotal time in history, of driving across the United States to document these pockets of resistance in small towns that you don't normally hear from. I approached PBS and Discovery Channel about this. Both were somewhat interested, but thought it was a little bit too edgy for their own audiences. And so I was left with this dilemma, what should I do? Well, the fact of the matter is that I now had these tools to actually tell the story myself, and this was just before YouTube had launched. And so I thought, you know what, I'm just going to do it myself. I got a little bit of money from covering the war in Baghdad. We're just going to get in the car, take our dog, like John Steinbeck did in Travels with Charlie, and just travel around the United States. And we did that. And we announced it to the world using a blog. And we started building an audience who began to follow us. But we had no money, no institutional support. But because our story was so compelling that, these former journalists who decided to drive around the United States without with only doing business with independent businesses, mom and pop, and only doing secondary highways, that actually captivated people's imagination. And we actually reached out to some of these grassroots organizations along the way. So before we were finished our trip, half of the film was actually suggested to us by the audience, or the people formerly known as the audience, as I like to say, because we'd actually had a participant community that we built through our story. And when we got home, I still had intended that this was the research trip and that I'd still be able to get a broadcaster to pick up the film, but they wouldn't. But when we got home, we were getting so many email from people across the country saying, could we have a copy of your film on DVD so we can show it to our communities to fight a Walmart that wants to come to our town? I said, well, might as well do that. So in Hollywood, it's death to say straight to DVD. In my world, where everything is upside down, it's great to say straight to DVD because you've got an audience for it, and that's what happened. So we built the community, and then afterwards the broadcasters came. And we were broadcast in Sundance Channel in the United States, CBC in Canada, NHK in Japan, Australia. But that was, to me, less important. What was really important, that this film was resonating in communities across the United States. Even just a month ago, Cape Cod invited me out to show the film there. And Hulu.com, which is the new industry answer to the declining numbers, at least on network television, has featured the film in the last few weeks on its site. So people can now watch the film for free. And this is 5 years after I made this homemade film that I edited in my living room. So to me, this is really a wonderful example both of how all of this can take advantage of these tools of technology, and secondly, how if you can come up with the right story, you can engage people who wouldn't normally find you or just see you among the noise because you've got a way to keep their attention. So this led me to the University of Washington, where we were living in British Columbia at the time, and my wife's from Seattle, so we thought we'd come down here and check things out. And I just popped into the University of Washington to talk about what I'd been doing, and they said, you should apply for this job. And I said, I have never taught before. I'm not really interested in academia. And they said, I'll just apply anyway. So I applied. And they also, said, well, maybe you should lead the program. And so I ended up saying, right, I'll try this out for a year. I love Seattle. Let's see how it goes. And what I did is I took my experience, because I embody this transformation that's happening in communication right now, from institutional, traditional media to this more crowdsourced, individual type of media. And students really appreciated that. And this is now what we're building upon. In the last couple of years, our program has tripled in size, and we're getting a lot of attention across the country. So in fact, we have 2 members of our faculty who are here today as guests, so I think that's nice that we're resonating so strongly. And at the same time, what's driving the interest in our program is what is this apparent decline in journalism. I actually don't see it as a decline in journalism itself. It's a decline in the economic model of journalism. As David Borden from the Seattle Times likes to say, that journalism doesn't have an audience problem, it has a business problem. I beg to differ slightly. I think the problem is that the audience doesn't want to support the business even though they're interested in the content. They're not willing to pay for this unless it's sports or financial news, and that really creates a problem for the content. And so it's hard to figure out how you're going to charge for this stuff. And so when it comes down to how you communicate effectively in this crazy turmoil of communication, what I like to say is that it's important that you create a value proposition for the people who you want to listen to you. And that comes down to, with all these social media tools, communicating authentically credibly and usefully and communicating that information directly to people you want to reach. You don't necessarily need journalism as your intermediary. You don't necessarily need a public relations firm. I firmly believe that organizations and individuals now can act using the journalistic function. And so a good example of this is in April, the Centers for Disease Control, during the height of the swine flu fear. At that point, the Centers of Disease Control for 2 weeks was the most trafficked website on the internet. And that's because people saw utility, value, and credibility in going to, incredibly, a federally funded organization for information for them to make decisions about their family and their health. That's something fairly revolutionary, because in the past, you would normally go to an intermediary like a journalist to decipher this and to tell you what you should understand and believe. And now there was a sense that these organizations, if they communicated properly through Twitter, through Facebook, through blogging, through all these different tools in this new information ecosystem, could directly talk to the people who needed this information. Another example is pharmaceutical companies, probably some of the most maligned actors in the private sector. They've managed to create communities of interest on the internet where people can congregate and talk about specific issues, such as muscular dystrophy or multiple sclerosis. And they don't actually sell anything directly to these people. They just create these communities. They happen to sponsor it and brand it, but it allows for people to communicate amongst themselves credibly, and it actually boosts the credibility of these organizations as well. So this is some of the new paradigm that we're seeing in sort of shifting communication. Also, just this week, we're seeing this new news ecosystem with the police murders in Tacoma. I first heard about it not by watching television news, but I heard about it on my Twitter feed. And then I was following the Seattle Times and King 5 on Twitter. I actually didn't really turn on TV that much. I read the newspaper a little bit. And then there was a University of Washington police alert that I got on my phone as a direct message. And then I heard about that the Seattle Times started quoting a student who had mentioned that. So it became this interesting feed. It wasn't just reporters from the Seattle Times and King 5 getting all the information. It was individuals and citizens sharing some information. It was the Seattle Times and King 5 saying, oh, we need to use this as well. In fact, Seattle Times put a Twitter feed right on their home page. So it was just an amazing use of these technologies, understanding that we're not as much in a hierarchy of information as we used to be, of institutional information, but it's now this ecosystem we're all playing along. And so this kind of thing is happening, and some people might poo-poo it, especially in older generations, and saying, well, it's a fad, these are novelties. But the fact of the matter is that technology is there, the demographics, the younger generations are using this stuff, and they're using it very seriously, and they expect it from organizations. And there's also just a higher penetration generally of people using technology. So we're creating this new thing, which I like to call, I think I stole it from somebody, the trust economy. We're also seeing a lack of faith in larger institutions because of what's gone on in the last few years, both with the war and with the economy. And so people are trying to figure out who they should trust. And there's a great confusion, but there's also a great opportunity. So this is also something we're seeing at the University of Washington. The University of Washington traditionally, through their marketing campaigns, has used press releases, used journalism to get their message out. And it's been challenging with the decline in journalistic interest in what we do for us to figure out how to communicate. But I also see this as an opportunity, and we've met on several occasions with the leadership of the University of Washington to figure this out. Because fundamentally, the university is a content creation machine. We have very smart, credible people who are constantly working on information and knowledge that should be shared with the world. And now we have the tools to communicate that directly. And with the decline, with journalism somewhat in retreat, there is a role for the university as an institution to actually get its information out there as much as possible to its community. So UW Marketing approached me and said, okay, we need to figure out how to use these social media tools, and you guys know how to do that in your program. And so he said, well, we've been using direct email up to now, so we think we should take that and use Twitter instead because it's free. And I said, well, that's not going to work. It doesn't translate directly. You can't take a sales pitch through one electronic media and then go to social media and say, we're just going to pitch people through Twitter. You need to convince people, first of all, and persuade them that they should pay attention to what you're saying on Twitter before you can even ask anything of them. And so the best way to do that, I told them, was to actually tell the university's story through your Twitter feed. Share the knowledge and information of what your best people are doing. Let them continue to be passionate and authentic about that story. And along the way, you could mention, oh, by the way, we're doing this campaign where we're trying to raise a certain amount of money. But that shouldn't be the driving premise of this channel. You have to share information. You have to create a value proposition through storytelling by building a community and by building this relationship. And when you build a relationship through storytelling, you build an emotional bond. In fact, it was Aristotle, many thousands of years ago, through his classic Poetics, who said that every story has a beginning, middle, and end. And the reason that works for an emotional bond is that, as you probably remember from your grade school English, the middle is the climax. And so you're trying to bring people along and have them pay attention to the story you're telling, but you're also ratcheting up the tension to a certain point. And then at the end, the denouement, when you let them go, there's also this empathetic release of emotion. And when they've followed you and trusted you to listen to the story up to then, you've got them by telling that story. Barack Obama did it very effectively during his campaign, and there are really great examples along the way of how social media and storytelling come together to get people to pay attention. Because information is no longer a scarcity in our society. It was 100 years ago, which is why journalism is so important. Information isn't scarce now. We have more information than we ever had in the history of our species. What's scarce more than ever is attention and trust, and that's what we need to address, and I think storytelling can do that. And so what's really important when you're beginning to think about this is that you don't look at consumers and message and audience. Those are old mass media terms. What I like to look at, especially what I'm exploring in this book, is that it's a relationship with a community of participants. These people don't have to listen to you anymore. So you need to give them a reason why they should come into the tent and interact with you. And usually some kind of value proposition combined with emotion is going to be the way to do that. So just for the purposes of the Q&A, and I really like Q&A. As a professor, I like to be put on the hot spot by my students who are very, very smart, very accomplished, and I believe that we're collaboratively building this body of knowledge about this really incredible subject matter that's very much in turmoil. But I can talk about Tiger Woods, because Tiger Woods, I first found out about Tiger Woods on Twitter. We saw this website called TMZ out of California that really puts out a lot of celebrity gossip. Traditional journalism at first didn't provide very much information when that story broke. A lot of people were saying, well, Twitter was the place to get it. And then traditional journalism came up after and started providing that and sort of feeding that ecosystem. But at the outset, this was what's happening. So even though my friend joked, you should talk about Tiger Woods, there's actually a good lesson in there. But I still would just like you to leave you with of my initial premise, that storytelling, this most timeless of notions, is more important than ever now that the information hierarchy is changing so quickly. And I also believe that Seattle really can be the storytelling capital. So I'll repeat the title of the book, the working title, just so I can see if I can open this up to Q&A, and I'd be happy to have you disagree with me. So trust me, how to tell stories in a credibility-starved world. Okay, so let's go at it. I'm hoping we'll get as much questions from you as possible. I think we've got at least 20 minutes to do that. Is that correct? Okay. All right. So thank you very much for paying attention, and let's have this. Okay, that's fine. So
I'm interested in how this story might be told on the other side of the world. Let's say in Malaysia or Romania. It seems to me that a lot of what you're saying is we may think of it as just technologically neutral or culturally neutral, but I don't think so. And being a third culture kid, I suspect you have a lot of thoughts about that.
It's a very good question. In fact, it allows me to plug the fact that if you've ever heard of the big annual event called TED, where they have all these incredible speakers on the West Coast down in California once a year, we have the rights to TEDx Seattle this year, so it's the franchise. So the MCDM, my program, and TED will be doing this big event in early March. And we've decided to focus specifically on emerging markets and technology and social media and how it's different in other countries, but how we can also learn and share from that. And so the answer is absolutely. There are different technologies at play, especially in emerging markets. And there, it's less the computer and it's more the cell phone. However, they are definitely playing a part in the social media game. As you probably remember, this summer in Iran, they were using Twitter and Facebook to mount this opposition to what had happened in the elections. And so you do have to understand that some of the tools are different, but the sentiment and the idea that you can share and use these new platforms to do so is very much the same. And so what we say is that if you want to be in the social media game, you first need to understand the people who you want to reach out to and figure out what tools they have. So in Seattle, you could say, okay, computers, if you're looking at an affluent group. If you're looking at a more sort of a younger, poorer group, you might say, maybe my first strategy should be cell phones, and that should be the answer for those countries that you mentioned as well. And in fact, there's been some great articles about how they're using cell phones in India, and it has nothing to do with iPhone or smartphone or data from AT&T. They're using simple things like text messaging, or even they can phone into a number and listen to music on their way to work. So it's very basic, but they're using these tools in a similar way. So it's a good question.
There's something I do not get, I do not understand. You can Twitter or read on email, read through social media, nonsense as much as fact. How do you establish credibility? How, in your trip across the country, doing what was obviously a wonderful movie, establish credibility? So I don't get the credibility part of your message. Yeah,
that's a good question. And the fact of the matter is, I also like to say that there's very little, there's some traditional media you shouldn't trust as well. I mean, there was some questions about the New York Times during the Iraq War. So I think this is just fundamental to how we communicate, that some things are seen as very subjective as more credible than not. But the answer to your question is that to establish credibility, you need to start building these relationships first of all. So I realized that I didn't have any credibility as a filmmaker. I used to work at NBC, but I no longer had that institutional credibility to get people to pay attention to me. So my strategy was, okay, first of all, I'm going to announce this to the world, even though nobody's paying attention to me right now, that I'm going to make this film. Secondly, I'm going to listen out there to people and communities of interest that maybe share the kind of message that I want to get out there. So are there any buy local communities online or any organizations in the grassroots that would embrace what I'm trying to do? And I found out there were, so I reached out to them. And I said, this is what I'm trying to do. I'm going to be sharing my story as I go across the United States for free. I'm not going to wait till I'm done to put this on a big screen, but you're going to get my message, my video, everything else along the way. And you can feel free to share those with your constituents. And they said, okay, we'll see how this works. And so I started doing that. And because I was so open and transparent in what I was doing, they began to see my message and what I was doing as credible. And so did these new users. And we began to see this growing of an audience behind somebody who didn't have the institutional backing. So it comes to that. It comes down to that relationship building, to sharing how you're actually doing it, to you being truthful and authentic when you're communicating, and to hoping that you can continually engage these people in what you're trying to do. And frankly, it works. And this is what happens. It's no longer saying, I'm from the New York Times, therefore you must listen to me and I am right. It's, okay, this is my name, this is my blog, this is my Twitter feed, this is what I'm trying to say. Do you want to pay attention to me? And if so, let me see what I can do for you that's going to make you continually interested in what I do. It's a heck of a lot more effort, but it does work. But it's much more noisy as well. And there's a lot of crap out there. There's no doubt about it.
Thank you very much for the very fascinating presentation. My question has to do with the impact on community and culture of the new social media and its very diverse approach to storytelling. It seems to me that the traditional media, the daily newspaper, if you would, PI or the Times, used to do what I would call kind of convene the community, call out the conversation for the day with the headline that may be of an international, national, or local import, but certainly on the regional page above the fold, you'd call out the important topic of the day, and you had what appeared to be majority of the community around that topic then talking about it at work, on the way to work, or on the cooler, whatever it is. There were issues that people kind of convened around. That seems to be waning, seems to be missing with this new technology. Is that an important element of building community and sustaining cultures? And how will this new media address it?
It's an important observation, and what you've said is very truthful. That's indeed happening. This is where I come off sounding like a radical. The question that you have to ask yourselves is, it doesn't have to be this way. When, mass media built itself up as mass media over the last 100 years through a very industrial revolution type approach to doing things where it was lowest common denominator. So Walter Cronkite, communicated to the world during the 1970s or the United States, huge audiences. And so there's that illusion that we're all part of this homogenous community. But the fact of the matter is, because of the way technology was happening at the time, people didn't have any choice. There were 3 channels and they watched one of them. Now we have more choice and we fragment into smaller communities. So to a certain extent, it's much harder to motivate us on a large scale way. But from another point of view, we have more choice. And I'd like to argue that what we've seen in the last 100 years with mass communication is actually an aberration. And that what we had prior to the creation of the print, well, not the printing press, but to, say, television and radio and newspapers in the 19th century, was a much more local, community-based approach to water cooler conversation and convening the community. And so we're now going back to this more fractured, but I think more engaged local approach to communication. And this is where storytelling comes in, because that's what storytelling was in a folk culture of the 19th century prior to the big players and these huge barriers to entry in communication. It was about convening within the community area around a fireplace or in a town hall to have conversations among a small group of people, not in a mass media kind of way. So there is something lost, there's no doubt about it, in terms of being able to motivate people in a big, around one subject. But I think there's also an opportunity to do things in a more tailored, customized, based on what people are looking for, community way. And so that's what I'd like to advocate, even as we recognize that we're losing something along the way.
Hanson, John Hamer, I run the Washington News Council. As you know, we've been trying to address some of these issues for the past almost 12 years now. I agree with much of what you've said, especially I liked you using the word transparent. I've been saying that if news media, no matter who you are, mainstream, hyperlocal, neighborhood website, individual blogger, if you're transparent, accountable, and open, you're going to be trusted more. I call it the Tao of journalism, T-A-O. But the lines have blurred, as you know. We have a potential complaint before the News Council now from a major Seattle elected official against a blogger whose blog is on a mainstream media site. So I'd like you to address, the ethical implications of this. There's much debate in the media world these days about moderation of comments. What do you take out? I mean, we used to edit letters to the editor extremely carefully. No anonymity allowed, no, defamation, no character assassination. But now a blogger can essentially libel, slander, defame an individual. And the mainstream site says they take no responsibility because it's an individual blogger. What are you telling your students about that problem? The wild, wild west on the internet and the ability to comment and say anything about anybody, anytime. Who is held accountable?
Yeah, it's a good question. In fact, when everybody can participate in this massive conversation, there are huge ethical implications, and we see that on a regular basis. I think, first of all, we need to address this at its root. We need to acknowledge, first of all, this is a reality, that anybody can communicate beyond their traditional circle, their traditional social circle of family and friends. So a 6-year-old kid at a computer can reach out to the world now. So that means that if to somewhat stem the tide of these ethical issues, I actually think that we have to train everybody in our society on multimedia literacy. So if you're going to teach kids how our government works, because they have to be responsible members of society and behave in a civic way, communication now is part of that civic responsibility. And so I think we need to actually start at the grade school level to teach communication. I think it's that important so we don't have some of these issues. The other thing to address is that because the barriers to entry are so low now in communication, you can pretty much have anybody say anything. In fact, there's even an issue right now. I was asked to participate in an interview today. There's been some pretty sordid photographs of the suspect in the Tacoma police killings, or Lakewood police killings, his picture after he was killed, and it's been circling on the internet, and so there are ethical issues there. We can put this stuff out now, and there's no control. I'd like to think that we're still in the novelty phase of this. And some people, we argue that sometimes that the community can actually self-regulate. That's somewhat of a utopian view of the internet. But I also think that we're going to see that as we realize that it's so easy to send 1 million emails to your senator, people are going to start paying less attention. If it's so easy to communicate, if you can send a letter to the editor so easily, it takes no effort, as opposed to handwriting something and putting a stamp on it, we actually might return a bit to what we had, say, 50 years ago, where we acknowledge that if somebody put a little bit more effort into communication, maybe we should pay a little bit more attention to them. And a good example of this is that when ABC was trying to cancel a show called Jericho a few years ago, irate audience didn't just email, they sent in packages of peanuts in protest. And that actually got people's attention, not just because of how dramatic it was, but because they realized that it actually took a little more effort to send that stuff than to actually just email, which people are beginning to tune out on. So I think this comes down to the currency of trust and conversation, and for us to recognize that these ethical issues are going to continue to pop up, and we're still trying to figure it out. But I think this whole currency of credibility will play a factor in it. But it's tough because we're so used to the journalism vocabulary that how do we quantify and qualify a blogger who doesn't necessarily being perceived as a journalist? And how do we protect them, or do we condemn them for what they've done? And you're facing these issues as much as I am. Sure. And this is the last question. I'll stick around for a couple minutes.
Hi, thank you for your comments. My name is Lee Keller. I have one of those public relations firms that you said wasn't going to be needed anymore, but no offense, it's okay. I'm good with that. But what I do want to talk to you a little bit about is how things are changing so much, and I personally don't want to stare at Twitter feeds all day. And in fact, I think the credibility, like John was saying, is a big issue. And I want the filter. I mean, I want some kind of filter. I want reporters who have the credibility to be filtering, and so do my clients, because none of us have the time to sit around and look at all of this. Now, the storytelling is great, but I guess what I'd like you to talk a little bit about is where those stories should be coming from and how that credibility enters into it if the filters are going to go away and we're all just supposed to sit around and, I mean, I actually don't want to hear the very first news about what's-his-face, Woods, because I want to know after the story has developed a little bit and somebody's sitting there working through all the details like they would do in a newsroom, then I want the story. I don't want it early on. And I think the way we're all getting hit every day with so much, I think a lot of people are in the same boat. So I'd just like you to talk a little bit about that filter.
That's a good, challenging question. And I think partly it's a cultural and demographic issue. I'm kind of in the same boat. I've actually complained about information exhaustion publicly because I'm constantly taking in these feeds. But I think I would like to say that there are younger generations who don't have that same problem as us. And I still get newspapers delivered to my doorstep every morning. And also, I just want to address quickly, I do believe that PR firms are actually more important than ever, but they just have to change their mission a little bit. In fact, PR firms can also play the journalistic function through transparent, credible communication. And it's a matter of telling stories not in a sales pitch kind of way, but actually in a way that people are going to say, you know what, this might be coming from a public relations firm, but I see some value in this. And I think I'm beginning to see a lot of my students getting hired by PR firms in Seattle to actually bring that message, and they're implementing that. But to address your main concern, I totally agree with you. I think the future issue, and actually the current issue of all of this, is the filter itself. How do we filter this? Because we don't have journalists or institutional communicators anymore as much to filter. And so how do we figure out what we should take in? And what I've been trying to say is that there are new ways to do that through storytelling, but also I think those filters have to exist. There's a Who song that says, meet the old boss, same as the new boss. In many ways, we're probably going to create a new pyramid, a new hierarchy. But what it's going to be is a different set of players. It's not necessarily going to be the traditional journalistic organizations. We can see blogs like the Huffington Post beginning to play this role. So I think as this all begins to roll out, we will say, enough of all this information. Let me start picking and choosing the places that I will rely on for credible information. And for you, it may still be news organizations and newspapers and what you're used to. But for other people, such as myself, I'm going to say, you know what? On a daily basis, I'm going to look at this blog, this particular person on Twitter and the Huffington Post, and I'll read the Seattle Times or the PI in the morning, and that's it. So I think it's going to be a different smorgasbord of information with some traditional players and some new players, but we're going to hear a greater diversity of voices, and it's going to require a little bit more effort from us as former news consumers to actually say, okay, what is true, what's not, what do I want to believe, who do I want to follow, and I must recognize that it's not just going to be the traditional people anymore. And who is telling me a story and communicating to me authentically and credibly that I want to follow? And I think that's what is going to happen, and I think it's happening already, and that's the model we're trying to build at the University of Washington through our program, and I think we're succeeding. So thank you very much for your attention. I'd be happy to address this otherwise.
Thanks again to all of today's program participants. Next week on December 9th, we'll meet at the Westin Hotel. Hanson mentioned him. We thought we were going to have Tiger Woods, but turns out his car's in the shop, so he won't be with us. But the program committee is hard at work to fill that spot, so stay tuned to your totem. And don't forget your holiday luncheon tickets today on the way out the door. To end our program, I leave you today with a limerick. When I forgot the birthdays, I got all upset. I was supposed to never forget. So I've changed my brain, I'm back in the game, and for the rest of the year, I'm all set. See you next week. We're adjourned.
Seattle Rotary Online is made possible in part by a grant from First Choice Health, working with the Washington Health Information Collaborative to use technology to bring better health care to patients throughout the Pacific Northwest. First Choice Health.